Today we're headed up Sassafras Mountain, the rooftop of the Palmetto State.
Hi, I'm Skye Marthaler. Welcome to Rooftops of America. Today, we're in the beautiful foothills of South Carolina and headed up to the top of the state. But before we start this adventure, take a moment to click that red subscribe button below and the bell icon next to it for all the latest Rooftops of America updates.
Located in the northwest corner of the state, Sassafras Mountain is part of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a section of the larger Appalachian Range. The mountain itself gets its name from the abundance of sassafras trees growing on its slopes. It's one of two state high points named after a tree.
The geology and physical geography of this place is one of transition. Pickens County is actually located in a transition zone between the Piedmont and the Blue Ridge Mountains. Sassafras Mountain is considered part of the South Carolina foothills.
The mountains in this area were formed over 430 million years ago, as one tectonic plate slid over another, forming a granite intrusion that was then uplifted over a period of several million years. The granite eventually metamorphized into the gneiss that make up the mountain.
The gneiss here is noteworthy in its own right. Sassafras Mountain is home to a particular type of that rock known as Henderson gneiss. It's actually pretty easy to spot on the outcrops as you walk your way up to the summit area.
South Carolina is a state more defined by its rivers than its mountains. There's almost 30,000 miles of rivers and streams, forming 8 major river basins in the state, each playing a part throughout the state's history and contributing to its economic development.
Sassafras Mountain is tied in with this extensive watershed network. It's the headwaters tri-point for the French Broad, Saluda, and Savannah rivers, basically meaning depending on which bit of water you would follow off the slopes of this mountain, you would end up either at the Atlantic or all the way over the Gulf of Mexico by New Orleans. Humans are thought to have settled in South Carolina around 13,000 years ago. At the time, the climate would have been more like what you find in modern-day New York or New England. These Paleo-Indians were hunter-gatherers, hunting throughout the region, though eventually they would settle along the river systems.
Later successor cultures would continue this trend, establishing communities along the major rivers of South Carolina, eventually developing agriculture and thriving complex societies. By the time the first Europeans arrived, they'd encounter elements of the Mississippian culture throughout the region.
The first Europeans to reach these shores were the Spanish in 1521. Later, Hernando de Soto would cross the state on his ill-fated expedition of the American Southeast in 1540. Establishing a colony here would prove to be difficult. Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon's effort in 1526 met with failure, and so too did a French effort several decades later in 1562.
Finally, in 1566, the Spanish established Santa Elena, a fort on modern-day Parris Island. It lasted for the next 2 decades, but eventually the Spanish would abandon their efforts here. By the 1600s, there were about 15,000 to 20,000 Native Americans across South Carolina, belonging to 4 major language groups: Siouan, Iroquois, Muskogean, and Gisabo.
The English would start to show interest in this area in the 17th century after they had some success establishing colonies along the Atlantic coast. In 1629, Charles I granted the Carolina Charter to Robert Heath. Heath may have had the grant, but he never did anything in the way in establishing a colony.
In 1665, Charles II transferred the Heath patent to 8 Lord Proprietors, who began the process of English colonization in the Carolinas. Colonization started in 2 areas. In the north, settlers from Virginia established a colony around Albemarle Sound. In the south, Charleston was established in 1670, and much of the colonial efforts in what would become South Carolina centered around that hub. By the time of the American Revolution, Charleston was one of the most important cities and ports in the southern colonies.
By the late 1600s, there were effectively 2 Carolina colonies, and the distance between the two made communication and governance difficult, to say the least.
To make management of these 2 areas easier, the colony requested the Crown to split them into 2 sections, and in 1710, Queen Anne granted the request, and North and South Carolina were created. By 1719, South Carolina became a royal colony under the purview of the Crown. Looking at a map of South Carolina today, you have to wonder why it is so small compared to its southern neighbors. It all started when the Carolinas were split into 2 sections. At the time, South Carolina still had a significant bit of territory and was actually the more powerful of the 2.
The northern border would cause no end of issues for South Carolina. Originally, when the 2 Carolinas were split, the Cape Fear River was supposed to serve as the border. Unfortunately, North Carolina had already started issuing grants to the land on both sides of that river. So it was determined that the border would shift 30 miles down the coast, and from that point, run northwest to the 35th parallel. Now, that sounds simple enough, but reality would prove to be another matter entirely.
Now, though, that they were 2 separate entities, it was imperative a definitive border was established between them, so land could be parceled out appropriately. Needless to say, the border between the Carolinas turned out to be complex, to say the least.
Further efforts to define the border had to deal with the lands granted by the king to the Catawba Nation. And then there was the actual surveying teams who kept veering to the north or to the south and back and forth to compensate that everybody was getting their equal portion. It's part of the reason South Carolina's border looks so odd compared to its colonial peers. And then throw another wrench into the mix. South Carolina's western frontier was abruptly cut off.
Surveying this diagonal line was a challenge. The first group never quite made it to the 35th parallel, stopping 11 miles short, a decision that would later affect all the following border efforts.
Despite the Georgia colony now being in place, South Carolina still possessed this weird thin panhandle that stretched all the way to the Mississippi River. Though any taller high point that South Carolina would have had would disappear when that section of land was transferred to the federal government after the American Revolution to absolve any debts that South Carolina may have incurred during the war.
While the border with North Carolina was being sorted, at the same time the colony of Georgia was being established. And in 1732, its northern border was to be the Savannah River. South Carolina didn't protest much because the new colony would serve as an effective buffer from southern Spanish threats.
Surveying through this rugged terrain would prove to be a challenge. Eventually, it was determined that the surveying teams would run a series of angles, slowly moving their way to the northeast. Along the way, they would split the watersheds that had been determined by the two Carolinas. It's one of the reasons the border actually splits Sassafras Mountain between North Carolina and South Carolina. In fact, it's one of only two state high points where the border runs right across the summit.
The far northwestern section of the border was finally solved in the early 19th century, but it too proved difficult. The border was supposed to run to the most northerly branch or stream of the Tougaloo River, to the 35th parallel. If you are seeking a bit more of an adventure, you'll find the South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina Tri-Point about 20 miles away from Sassafras Mountain in Chattanooga Gorge. Down near the bottom of the gorge, you'll find two spots, Ellicott and Commissioner's Rocks. Both are remnants of the border challenges of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia.
As you may expect from a border that proved to be so difficult to mark off originally, it continues to create challenges even to this day. In the 90s, the northern border of South Carolina was resurveyed with GPS technology. Then, the ridgeline itself was resurveyed as recently as 2005, almost 3 centuries after the original split.
This was Cherokee territory when the English arrived. The largest Cherokee town here was Keowee, located on the lower Cherokee Traders Path. Trade with the Cherokee was a lucrative business, but even with this economic incentive, this area took a while to get settled.
One of the first Europeans to settle in this part of South Carolina was an English trader by the name of James Beamer. Beamer came here to establish trading relationships with the Cherokee. And by the 1720s, these relationships would prove incredibly lucrative. Them, along with the indigo and cotton plantations, turned Charleston into one of the richest ports in the American colonies.
The burgeoning trade brought unwelcome eyes from Cherokee rivals. Fort Prince George was built at the request of the Cherokee to help them defend themselves from their enemies. It would be built in 1753 and became the principal trading post with the Cherokee lower towns. Even so, conditions with the Cherokee eventually deteriorated, exploding into the Anglo-Cherokee War of 1758. Cherokee attacks and the British response devastated the area. Despite early Cherokee victories, they were eventually forced back as the British launched a punitive expedition into their territory, razing and burning the lower and middle towns.
Interestingly enough, the Cherokee and the British were able to patch up their alliance, but it had the unintended consequence of actually increasing tension between the Cherokee and the colonists. This tension would build and erupt into further conflict and also plant the seeds for the eventual 1830s Indian Removal Act.
Issues with the Cherokee came to a head once again in 1776 during the American Revolution. Their alliance with the British made them a target for the rebelling colonists. Conflicts erupted on the frontier as both parties launched raids against each other. By 1777, the Cherokee were forced out of this area of South Carolina.
Settlement in this part of South Carolina would slowly start to increase after the American Revolution, mainly by soldiers returning home from the war. One of them was General Andrew Pickens, who is the namesake for both the county and the county seat. he would establish his Hopewell plantation in the foothills.
While Pickens was born in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, he became a significant figure in South Carolina history, establishing his plantation in the frontier by the Kiowa River, across from the Cherokee lower towns, then serving with distinction at several battles in South Carolina during the American Revolution, then later serving as a representative both on the state and federal level.
By 1791, there were only 2 towns in this area, the original Pickens Courthouse and the delightfully named Pumpkin Town. As a political entity, Pickens County went through several iterations before ending up as it is today. It started as the Washington District and then evolved into the Pendleton District, which in turn evolved into the Pickens District by 1860.
Settlement here was slow, and the area remained sparsely populated. Economically, the region was focused on agricultural, mainly cotton production, though timber and milling also provided some industry. It became known as the Dark Corner due to the dense forests and mountains, a term first used in 1832. One of the more interesting historical sites in this area is Hagood Mill, built in 1845. This wasn't the first mill on this site. Earlier mills were thought to have been there since the 1790s. This one, though, has stood the test of time and was active until 1968.
During the U.S. Civil War, this area didn't see much incursion by Union forces. That said, it was not conflict-free. The foothills provided a haven for deserters and marauders, and those groups were notorious for terrorizing the communities in the region.
Modern-day Pickens County wasn't formed until after the U.S. Civil War during the 1868 South Carolina Constitutional Convention, when the district system was abandoned. The counties were implemented statewide.
After the Civil War, during the period known as Reconstruction, a new industry would start to take shape here in the foothills of South Carolina: moonshining. This area had been left destitute, and for the residents still living here, it was easier and more profitable to grow corn and then convert it into alcohol than it was to grow corn and sell it as grain.
This area proved ideal for moonshining. There were few roads in, a ready supply of grain, a small population distrustful of strangers, and lots of hideaways tucked away in the mountains. A perfect combination for producing illegal alcohol. One of the most notorious moonshiners was Lewis Redmond. He became known as the Prince of the Dark Corner. He had several notorious run-ins with the law, including the murder of a U.S. Marshal. At its height, his bootlegging operation covered 3 states.
Moonshining may have been a dangerous and illegal business, but that sure didn't stop people from doing it. It would thrive in this area throughout the first half of the 20th century, even getting a boost in popularity during Prohibition and the ensuing Great Depression. There were more than a few still up and running well into the 1950s.
Slowly, though, more development in industry found its footing here. In the beginning, textile production was dominant. After World War II, more diverse manufacturing moved in. Along with this came a more robust transportation network, providing easier access for people as well.
These days, if you're visiting the upcountry of South Carolina, you will find a treasure trove of outdoor activities and beautiful locations. After all, Pickens County's slogan is "Adventure starts here."
This county is home to numerous parks, wilderness areas, waterfalls, and lakes, to include such highlights as Jocassee Gorge Wilderness Area and Table Rock State Park. In addition to the state high point, you'll also find the tallest mountain located totally within South Carolina. Pinnacle Mountain can be found at Table Rock State Park. It comes in with an elevation of 3,415 feet. If you want to bag this peak, you'll have to put in a bit of work. It's a 4.2-mile hike from the trailhead to the summit.
Now, though, let's actually focus on Sassafras Mountain itself. Of all the U.S. state high points, this one seems to have underwent the most change in recent years. Winding the clock back, though, a significant amount, in the early 20th century, there actually used to be an automobile road that ran across this peak, connecting this part of South Carolina with Brevard and Roseman in North Carolina. Eventually, though, the land here was purchased by Duke Energy.
Despite the peak being privately owned, it was accessible to the public. At one point, this high point had a cabin and fire tower at the summit, but it fell into disrepair and was torn down in 1993. For the next 20 years, it was covered by woods. In 2004, Duke Energy sold the South Carolina side of their holdings to the state government. And in 2012, there was an effort by Clemson University to improve the parking area and put in an observation deck below the summit area. And while it provided an excellent view, it wasn't the big open views people really desired.
When I first visited this peak in 2013, you could have made a pretty good case that this was an overlooked high point. The summit area was still pretty wooded in. There had been some improvements, though. The High Pointers Foundation had put in a bench, and there was a boulder in place with a plaque on it designating the height and location of the summit.
The following year, the trees were gone, cleared out to make the area more accessible and to provide a scenic view. One of the immediate beneficiaries of this clearing was the new weather station put in place in December 2014. It was a first for South Carolina to have data coming in from their highest point.
There was a larger push, though, that had been underway for years, and that was to build a true observation platform on the summit. Once this project actually was able to retain funding, it really started to pick up speed. And then, an effective partnership with North Carolina, who donated 4 acres, ensured that the platform could actually be built.
By 2018, construction of the new observation platform was well underway, and in 2019, the platform was open to the public. Now, visitors were able to take in the full view from Sassafras Mountain.
In the past, there were limited options on how you would reach the top of Sassafras Mountain. You basically had 2 of them. You either did it the hard way, via like the Foothills Trail, or you did it the easy way. Drive up, park, and walk up the path a couple hundred meters.
If you want the longer, harder route, you can take the Foothills Trail, the premier long trail in South Carolina, stretching 77 miles between Table Rock and Oconee state parks. The drive up is still readily available as well. Just take the F. Van Clayton Memorial Highway to Sassafras Mountain Road to reach the top.
Now, though, there is a third option to get to the top of Sassafras Mountain, and it sort of splits the difference between the hard and the easy. That partnership with North Carolina continues to bear fruit for the mountain, because in 2022, Sassafras Mountain finally got a direct hiking route to the top.
For interested hikers, you'll find the trailhead in the newly established Headwaters State Park in next door, North Carolina. It is a 2-mile hike to the summit.
from the parking lot, it's super straightforward to get to the new observation platform. Let's go check it out. This is a very straightforward hike. You just follow the concrete path all the way up. You go through the gate, and it's pretty much where the old road used to be that you'd take before this was all developed. Super simple, super straightforward. But there is one odd thing about this. The concrete trail, which is super smooth and easy to negotiate, is not actually tied in with the accessibility ramp. That seems to be a bit of an oversight, and hopefully they'll remedy it soon.
While there is technically a disabled access trail, it is not convenient. It's rocky, steep, and narrow, not conducive for someone, say, in a wheelchair. Ironically, the ramp up the actual observation tower is excellent.
No matter which option you take, once you reach the top of the platform, you'll be treated to one of the best views in the state of South Carolina. And here we are on the summit of Sassafras Mountain, the rooftop of South Carolina. One of the weird little quirks about this peak is its various heights. Some places listed at 3,560 feet, others at 3,533 feet. But here, by the benchmark and the plaque, it's listed at 3,553 feet, making this the 29th highest state high point in the USA. I'm Skye Marthaler. Thanks for joining me on Rooftops of America. Before you go, leave a comment and click the like and subscribe buttons below, and I'll see you soon.